I need a shower. Alrighty, so I have returned. I don't even remember when the last day was that I did this. I know it was hot when I did this the last time. Whatever. Works. If you're looking at this, I bumped my head on something, so yeah. Got a solid thwack as I bent down to pick something up. Just right on an edge. Ouch. Anyway, so world building exercises. I have to admit, I've been goofing around with my, I guess we'll call it a mega world build for fantasy role playing. And so I made some adjustments there to some of the story elements. And I think it's sort of still gestating a little bit. There are a few little surprises I'm sure that'll come as I go further into it. But I did have myself suddenly pondering in the last few days whether or not there's a way to do something similar for science fiction. So contemplating building a mega playable science fiction setting. So if you're kind of wandering into this for the first time, the title should be a joke on Voltron, I think, if I did it right. By our powers combined. But it's more of a taking a look at the idea of combining existing worlds. So one of the first things I did was I took a look at a big list of existing science fiction settings, and you start to peruse them and find a way that they're similar to each other. So like you've got Star Trek and Star Wars, but you've also got things like Babylon 5 and Firefly, Chronicles of Riddick, Aliens, Stargate. What else did we do? Terminator. Okay, so really just kind of taking a hard look at universes that have made big impacts in pop culture. Now, admittedly, when I go through in my head some of this stuff, I get some unusual lists. So, Cowboy Bebop's on there. Ed McCaffrey's Tower and Hive, and Larry Niven's Known Universe, Ghost in the Shell, Blade Runner. Dune's a big one for me. So, why would you drive past people's houses with a noise like that at this time of night? You're a jerk if you behave that way. So one of the things I find quickly when I build these lists of universes is you start to be able to sort some of them, but it's weird because there's certain ones that like, oh, is this like if you look at Planet of the Apes, Jurassic Park, where do they fit? And you can tend to definitely see like a Neuromancer or the Sprawl for Cyberpunk. That's a certain type of setting, and it has a lot in common with things like Snow Crash, Ready Player One, Ghost in the Shell, Ex Machina. So you have some of these things that they sort of fit relatively well together, but you have to ask at certain points whether or not that's a very cyberpunk grouping. Another group would be dealing with psychic powers. So you might have something like what did we have? Babylon 5 has one of those categories that mixes and matches with other ones, because Babylon 5 has a very Star Wars or Star Trek feel. It actually does a little bit of both. It's alien relations and diplomacy. It's a space war, and it has to do with people leaving Earth to explore and interact with other races, but still be resident on Earth. So you have psychics, space, aliens, diplomacy. So like if you look at something like Chronicles of Riddick does not have aliens to speak of. They are variants on humans who have gone in different directions. Same with Firefly. Cowboy Bebop is all within our solar system, and it does not have aliens. And they border on psychic powers, but never out and out say it. Because the thing with Firefly, and it's something that's been on my mind recently, because I just rewatched some of the episodes, or I think I just rewatched Serenity is what I just watched a bit of, and they play it up as she can perceive what's going on around her, but it has some similarities to Dune. I'm sort of rambling here, but Firefly has similarities to Dune because in Dune, there are organizations that have honed special abilities, but they're never really psychic abilities. Like the Bene Gesserit ability to use the voice to influence the minds of others is, if I remember correctly, described as micromanagement of tonal qualities to slip past defenses and make the suggestion feel like it came from the mind of the person you're speaking to. It's very close to hypnosis, like a one-shot hypnosis. You don't have to induct them. You don't have to do any of the processes that build up to it. You just, out the gate, hit them with hypnosis and plan in a post-hypnotic suggestion. And their ability to sort of explore the future and prophesy the future is moderately on the edge of psychic, but it's sort of pressed into the service of the idea of, like, a mentat can make calculations on par with a computer. And so they take the idea of a human mind pushed to the edge of the calculating ability of a computer, but instead of calculating raw numbers, calculating philosophies and thought processes observed in the environment around them, and being able to make predictive calculations based off of that. And it's very similar to Asimov's Foundation, where psychohistory, where your ability to run the calculations give you the ability to calculate the course of human history going forward. And so these things have commonality, but Firefly, the Foundation, and Dune, at least in the early portions of each of them, do not have psychic powers to speak of, but they have mental abilities that exceed what normal humans can and fill the same role in a way that, like, when you look at certain fantasy, they'll give you a magic device, that, like a stone that you can hold in your hand, and you touch it on a certain symbol and you're able to talk to somebody somewhere else. It's a cell phone. That's a cell phone, but you've made a magical version of it so it makes sense. And so The Dune and the Foundation and the Firefly, they all sort of have that sort of, we've given you a magic stone that does the same thing as psychic powers do. Or perhaps it's the other way around. They give you natural human talents that could be expanded to a slightly fantastic level. And if you just switch over to using a magical explanation for it, it becomes psychic powers. But Babylon 5 distinctly does use psychic powers, where they have, I think they call them psychics or psychor. But they are a diplomacy and alien-filled environment, so they have aliens in them, which makes them more of a Star Wars, Star Trek sort of setting. I think those are the big ones I have for that, and Farscape. So it fits in that category, but it's also got psychic powers, which can put you in parallel with Star Wars and Star Trek a little bit. Not as much in Farscape, but I do think there's a little bit of that in Farscape. So that really has like some space fantasy elements to it. But what I'm trying to do is string a lot of these together in such a way that the settings sort of form a line. And so I'm looking at it and trying to figure out how to slap these together. They self-sort into some of these groups, but some of them are outliers, and they could go in any one of the groups. So you have AI and robots. You have psychic powers. You have aliens. You have genetic engineering. You have time travel. So when you mash up a lot of these universes, you can run them in strings, timeline-wise in some cases, where, for example, you would start with, I suppose you would start sort of with a cyberpunk, and then you would move from like Neuromancer to Ready Player One to Ghost in the Shell, and then you start moving into the more advanced robots and artificial intelligence, to the point where you could end up with like a Blade Runner situation, Terminators, and Battlestar Galactica. So you have the ability to build these chains, but not every one of them fits right in the specific chain. And so building these groups is easy. You can just build a giant list. I did this earlier, and I've basically deleted half the list because I don't think they all fit. I could have pulled them off to the side and put them in as a separate universe build. So like I could have used Jurassic Park, Planet of the Apes, and went through some other genetic engineering. So Gattaca, what would be some other ones on that score? If you took something like that and you started forming a cluster, and then you necessarily look at the idea of which seem to precede the others. So messing around with altering apes seems like it's easier to do than building an extinct animal again. So you would probably do Planet of the Apes, followed by Jurassic Park, and then messing around with human genomes. That could go on either end. Like eugenics is a thing that exists, and we've attempted to do that through selective breeding in the past. And we have done test tube babies by selectively choosing the genetics that way. And if you have somebody with a propensity for a disorder on the Y chromosome, there are ways that you can sort sperm to only isolate the X chromosomes or the Y chromosomes, depending on which part of the centrifuged cylinder they end up in. And you could then selectively choose for specific male or female. And if a person has X or Y specific disorders, you can filter those out, selectively choose to eliminate those. And then based off of those breeding stocks, you could see in a generation or two that you would be able to selectively choose the ideal or supposed ideal human form. And so you could easily build that one as a start, because you don't have to out the gate use genetic engineering to do that. So it's not quite Gattaca, but you could do a Gattaca, Planet of the Apes, and then Jurassic Park. So it's sort of a timeline. But the trick to it is, with these settings, they almost always are built to be standalone. Like Gattaca has a very specific outcome to its storytelling that sets up like not a lot of room for messing around with other things. So you could throw in movies like Splice, and there was another one like that too, wasn't there? Where somebody engineered a human being. I don't know, but you could Splice would be post Jurassic Park, I feel like, because that's legitimately building a living thing from non-existent materials. You're not trying to revive extinct species, and you're not tweaking an existing one, which is what all the others do to that point. But if you go from Gattaca, which I'm a little vague on how that story ends, it's been a while, but it doesn't leave you room necessarily to be able to jump into the consequences of their messing around with apes somewhere else in the world. And if you do Planet of the Apes, the consequence of that is apes overthrow mankind and wipe out the earth, and humans become animals and apes become the superior beings. That's a little hard to then proceed to Jurassic Park from. So you definitely have to tweak them. You have to mess with them. It's a little bit like you could bend them a little bit so that the apes conquer a continent, and meanwhile somebody's messed around with dinosaurs, and so now they're kind of loose in the world again. So it's apes and dinosaurs conquering the world. And I mean, the same thing goes with alien invasions, which is like such a full fleshed out arena of options. It's Independence Day, War of the Worlds. Why is my brain freezing on remembering any others? I know there are like 100 movies in that category of aliens coming to Earth and taking over. Larry Niven did one that was Footfall, I believe, and it was with Barnes, I think. Niven and Barnes did Footfall, which was like alien elephants conquering the Earth. Predator is sort of like an alien invasion, but not quite. Like, what else you got? We've got, heck, even the TV show Roswell was a sort of alien invasion. V, it was an alien invasion. What was the one with the glasses when you put them on, they let you see that the advertising is consume? or whatever. That one is predicated on the idea of an alien invasion that took over. So there's a lot of alien invasion ones, and they're all not built to interact with one another. They're pretty much standalone. So you have to sort of cut the ends off and cut the beginnings off in some cases. And even then, they fit together poorly, so that you're going to have to do some rework to get them to fit. But if you were to take an alien invasion one and a genetic engineering one and try to merge them, the consequences of the lines that you build out of each of them don't mesh super well. You kind of have to do, like when I built my fantasy role-playing game setting, I benefit a little bit from the ability to make multiple worlds that are sub-worlds to the central world. And you kind of have to build multiple worlds for this to work. Now, if you do a lot of these mashups, you could do just a string mashup. You just pick the ones that line up and you stop on either end. That works. That's totally doable. If you want to do a mega massive multi-series mashup, you're likely to encounter the need to split Earth, because the Earth is oftentimes the starting foundation of a lot of these things. So if you take the movie Alien, their ship is a trade ship that's a slow boat ship. They have a sleeper pods. They go into cryostasis and they're asleep as they travel to their location for trade and needed supplies and whatnot. And they encounter the aliens there, but they've departed from Earth. So it's still from Earth to another location. It's far enough in the future that you've got these sleeper ships. And you're encountering a xenomorph, I guess is the term for them, bug-like alien. You can't really reconcile that as the same Earth that the series of Ghost in the Shell takes place in easily. You really have to build them as separate worlds. And so to a certain degree, it becomes a question of, like, what part of each of those settings do I want to have? So how do I break this down? Because one of the things I do a lot in this channel is take a piece of pop culture, break it into its constituent parts, and then take those parts and choose which parts I'm going to use to build a new piece from. Because sometimes there's a piece you just have to leave behind. Sometimes it's that the alien setting takes place from Earth. You look at the alien setting, and other than humans, no other species seem to exist until we find those alien pods. So it would be from homeworld to colony worlds in sleeper ships. No other alien species found. So looking at that, where does that fit if I want to include something like RoboCop, Firefly, Star Trek? Like, how does that all work? And so I guess I can really just kind of land on where I ended up going is I want to start. This is going to sound stupid. Of course it's going to sound stupid because it's all make-believe that I'm slapping together in weird ways. So I think the place I want to start is the concept of Farscape. Farscape is a setting which is contemporary Earth, where there is a test pilot scientist named John Crichton who gets into a test flight vehicle that will take them into space, where they're going to test their propulsion system. And when they do, they kind of slam through what is sort of like a hidden wormhole. And they end up somewhere else in the galaxy, in the midst of a conflict in space between other beings. And there are human-like beings that he ends up interacting with called the Peacekeepers. Okay, that's what we're dealing with. Starts in current day world, test pilot finds wormhole or some portal in space. If we do that, this is a good setup for where we're going to go in a step or two of Stargate SG-1, where Stargate involves a gate that opens a portal to travel to other solar systems. Now, they usually have theirs on a planet, but we could just change that little detail to finding these gates in orbit. So if John Crichton's ship finds a gate in the solar system and passes through, you've got Farscape. But you've also got the possibility of people going to investigate what happened to the test flight, finding that gate, and not knowing what coordinates to dial to find John Crichton. They start exploring through the gate system. So you start to have a Stargate SG-1. A little bit more of a Stargate universe aspect of it, I think, but close enough. And so I kind of set those two. There's something in the middle of there that I put there. There is a classic Canadian sci-fi series called Scanners. Then there's the sci-fi movie from the US, I believe. It's called Push. And then there's the sci-fi series from the US, or it's a series, but it started, Scanners, Push, and Limitless are all movies. I don't mean to say series. So Scanners was a movie about people who had the government trying to track them down because they have psychic abilities. Push is similar. Limitless is somebody who can augment their mental abilities for thinking with a pill. But there's a danger that if you take that pill and then you don't take it anymore, it could destroy your brain and you'll die. So right here we have these special brain abilities. The Limitless aspect sounds an awful lot like where we're going to end up with the Mentats in Dune. And possibly the Bene Gesserit in Dune. But Push and Scanners are essentially giving people X-Men or psychic powers as a sci-fi premise. And we're going to need some of that to be a possibility as we expand further into the other series, or other universes. But all right now we have Farscape goes down through the psychic scale to the Stargate scale. Now, you could possibly make it that the abilities that the Scanners and the Push psychics have may be something that benefits targeted gate travel. So the minds of those particular types of people. And you do see a little bit of it in Stargate Atlantis, particularly. Stargate Atlantis uses the premise that people who have some of the genes from the ancients in their ancestry have the ability to turn on and access the technology of Atlantis. So they can activate the gates. They can activate the technology of the ancients. So with that sort of premise, the idea of potentially activating the gate through Scanners, Push, and Limitless type people sort of fits there. Where we're going to go next from there, though, is Minority Report, which sounds like a weird choice, but Minority Report starts you off with basically technology to predict when somebody is going to commit a crime in the future, so you can arrest them before they do it. And it has elements of cyberpunk to it, but at its core, the technology to do the prediction is down to 3 psychics in a tub, like a sensory deprivation bath. They float them there, and it's part of the story. I don't think that world is hugely developed in a lot of ways. There's room for more development. But Minority Report has some side shoots off of it. So we have a world dealing with crime and trying to stop it. And so you have the predictive algorithm that you can use, but you also may use something along the lines of RoboCop. So RoboCop and Minority Report, maybe not the exact same time frame. Maybe RoboCop comes first, and the programs attempt to make that happen kind of end up suggesting that they won't be able to use this as a dependable technology. It's sort of like a one-shot. Whereas Minority Report's technology for predicting it seems to be an adaptable technology that they can use. On that same level, you want to have a world that needs this law enforcement capability. So you're going to include things like Neuromancer, which is the sprawl, a cyberpunk, crime-riddled, moderately dystopian world. And because you've got the same time chunk of space-time, you can use Snow Crash. And it's kind of funny that we're looking at like the cyberpunk concept, because Gibson does have a saying where the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So you can have these certainly vastly different approaches to dealing with crime and the technology that you use to deal with it happening at the same time. They're just happening in different parts of the world where certain things haven't gotten to them yet. So the RoboCop technology pretty much is inherent to the area of Chicago where it exists. RoboCop can't cover the entire United States. So LA or New York might use a Minority Report, and Shanghai may use Neuromancer, and Snow Crash I think took place in California, so you could probably do that. And their stories are oftentimes dealing with global or planetary issues, but they're largely taking place in the events of a few people that know they're happening, and the rest of the world is oblivious to these events as they happen. So that whole series of Minority Report, RoboCop, Neuromancer, Snow Crash can be worked to all be happening in the world at the same time. And part of that process of reconciling that happening in different regions at different rates can lead to you to figuring out what are the relationships between, say, the area where a RoboCop is being built versus an area where Snow Crash and Neuromancer are taking place. What's trade like between those regions? What's diplomatic relationships like? What's the deal with the Asian economic powerhouses and how they're dealing with trade embargoes with other countries? Because they have a system for dealing with what they're dealing with that's different from how other places are dealing with it. So you get a more fleshed out sense of how the world works once you move past the Stargate SG-1 setting, which is contemporary. We're moving sort of into the future at this point. but not very far. But each one of those settings leaves you a little bit of room to where we go next. So the next step down is where things sort of start to split. The Neuromancer Snow Crash type setting is decidedly cyberpunk. And so when I built my chain of cyberpunk stories, one of the things I had to see was like where things fit in the timeline. If you start from something like Neuromancer, you have basically hackers and a moderate amount of internet usage. But Snow Crash has a virtual reality environment where you can go attend parties. But it's described as still a little primitive. It's a little ahead of where we are right now, but it's very similar to what was out there for a little while called Second Life, like Sims or multiplayer online role-playing games. So like WoW, those kinds of things. But Snow Crashes is literally just a version of that duplicates the world we already live in. But taking a step down from Snow Crash, further into the future, you can imagine a world like the movie Ready Player One, or the book, depending how you look at it. And that setting is developing that virtual world technology much, much further. And the technology built around those aspects and exploring the implants and the indentured servitude and the food processors. And one of the characters in the book, he gets an apartment and he gets basically a device that serves him meals readily every day. He has a virtual exercising space that he can use. He has a chair that gives him complete haptic technology. Now, I was debating whether or not I wanted to take that concept further out into the idea of the Matrix, because that's just a virtual reality taken to the extreme. But it didn't fit with where I was going next. So from Ready Player One, I wanted to explore the expansion of the cybernetic augmentation aspect and went with Ghost in the Shell. The thing about Ghost in the Shell that's very interesting is, and spoilers if you've not seen it, but Ghost in the Shell and the movie, not the standalone complex itself, is a series. But the movie Ghost in a Shell ends with the main characters merging with an AI that was seeking to be free of the control and restraints put on it by humanity. So they merge with that. So you get this human AI hybrid within a cybernetic, almost completely cybernetic body. The very next step from that is an AI mind and an AI, a robotic body that starts to become or demonstrate humanity. And so the movie Ex Machina explores that concept. So that's the next one down on the run. But the idea of Ex Machina is, this is a prototype. This is one of a very few to explore how realistic a being you can create. And that gets us very close, enough that I'm putting them side by side, Ex Machina with Blade Runner, where you have artificially created people running loose in the universe, and you have to try to track them down and figure out who's real and who's not. So you have them side by side. The Ex Machina is an AI robot, and you can sort of expand on that a little bit further with there's a way further out in the timeline, there's what's called the Butlerian Jihad, which is what happens in the early phases of Dune. It's the distant past in the Dune series, but it's where robots conquered us, and we eventually declared war and fought them to a degree that when we finally beat them back, we went back to a technology that couldn't think. So we went mechanical and electronic, but not integrated circuits. We avoided those things because that was what almost destroyed us the first time. So that's following that path all the way out to Dune. But on the parallel, where we start with Blade Runner, where you have artificially created beings that blend in and are indistinguishable from humans in many cases, that sounds an awful lot like Terminator. So you take Terminator as a next step, where the Terminators are trying to kill us and overthrow us, that can run in parallel with the computers took over and the Butlerian Jihad is responding to. So they should run paired side by side. And then further out from the Terminator is the last dregs of civilization fleeing from the robots that we created. This is Battlestar Galactica. So it's a fleet of people trying to escape the destruction of their home by the AI robotic forces, some of whom can look like us. That's a lot more of the newer Battlestar Galactica than the older one. But this still stands that's one of the things we can definitely explore. If you wanted to go Battlestar Galactica old school, then you could have the Cylons having been created, I believe in the original series, the Cylons were created by another race, and they killed their masters, and then they encountered humans and wanted to wipe them out too. So you could totally do that. You can take the machines that were built and become part of the Butlerian Jihad and have them be occupying a different area of space and then encroaching on the Battlestar Galactica universe. So that's doable. And that sort of brings us to the end of that leg. But back up top where we had Ready Player One happening, there are two others in parallel to it. So we just below Minority Report, RoboCop, Neuromancer, and Snow Crash, we're all still on the same Earth. But just barely. And if we remember, we've opened up a Stargate in the solar system that allows us to travel to other locations. And when we go there, we're going to find out that the reason that gate was there was in the distant past, some individuals from another part of the galaxy. And this is where you could throw in some of those time travel sci-fis, where potentially traveling through time as well as space may net you somebody who's a future civilization develops time travel. They send people to the past on a different planet, and those people may have the means to travel through space. They may build the gate network before anybody discovers it. So you could throw that in there. I didn't do that yet. I'm not sure I want to commit to that. But we have a gate system. And one of my favorite Niven pieces from the known universe, Larry Niven's known universe, is called Gill the Arm. And it's essentially on Earth, there was a young man who was born. He saw an opportunity to earn money mining some of the asteroids. And while doing some of that mining, he lost an arm, but discovered he had sort of like a psychic ability that allowed him to, with the lost arm syndrome that some amputees get, where they can still feel their limb. His psychic ability lets him actually pick up things with his forgotten limb and feel with it. And so he develops that ability, and then he gets a transplanted arm, and now he has essentially 3 arms. He's got his 2 arms, but he's got a phantom limb that he can move things with and feel things with, but nobody can actively see. And he becomes a detective. And I am a fan of those stories. But taking a similar idea, I wouldn't exactly rip that idea whole hog out of it. You can do something like Lost a Leg or something to that effect. But that is an expansion on the Minority Report, Scanners Push, Limitless, Mind Power kind of story pieces. And so Gill the Arm is part of the first part of that thread that expands from there. And I'm feeling like, instead of mining through the asteroids, what if he took the opportunity to go through the Stargate and help establish a colony there? Because it sort of fits. It doesn't require Earth necessarily. It just requires an Earth for him to return to. He's mining asteroids. He's injured. He heads back to the main world, gets the transplant, and works as a detective on that world. So if he's passed through a gate onto a parallel world where there were some existing human populations and people coming back from colonies, lived on the Earth at that time. So that works perfectly fine there, and leads us room to establish the world where psychics are the thread that we follow. And it's distinctively different from the Dune style, or maybe even like the Star Trek style. What's her name? Beta Z, the counselor Deanna Troi on Star Trek The Next Generation, or the Vulcan mind meld, or that kind of stuff. It gives us room to distance that from the rest of them. So Gill the Arm is the universe starter for the next one. Is a favorite of mine from Anne McCaffrey, which was the Tower and Hive series, which is literally people who got better and better at using their mind powers and finding technology that they can tap into that'll give their powers a boost. And they've become sort of like, I don't want to say conductors, but like, it's almost like the old telephone operators where you'd call them up and they'd plug you into a socket to send your message somewhere else. And if you networked that with package and postal services, you essentially have the Tower and Hive series. You have people who have these extraordinary mental abilities tapping into sort of like a device that boosts their ability so that they can send messages, real-time messages, across vast distances of space instantly. And it also gives them the ability to take their psychokinetic, their ability to psychically move things through space, to a degree where they can sort of psychically use the power to whoosh things through the fabric of space, essentially teleporting an object from one side of, well, I don't think they ever do one side of the galaxy all the way to the other, but from one solar system to another relatively effectively. But in the Hive and Tower series, they're still dominantly all humans. Some of them adapted to other worlds, and so they look a little bit different. But during the course of several novels in that series, they encountered a hive species that are rapidly growing hives with a queen and different types of bugs that serve the hive mind. I don't know about you, but that makes me think an awful lot of Alien and Aliens. And so that's the next one down the list. And I'm a little uncertain where on that time frame, if I want to lead back to Blade Runner style synthetic humans also being a part to the Aliens universe and Blade Runner's universe could have some crossover. Not sure I want to do that yet. But Aliens universe does fit right on the tail end of Tower and Hive, but it also fits right at the start of Starship Troopers, where they're fighting the bugs. And that could be two different approaches to that conflict. They resolve it better in Tower and Hive, I think, but Starship Troopers maybe just one of the alternatives that somebody else is doing. You know, political structures tell you that certain people may not take the best way out of a problem. They may pick a fight where there doesn't have to be one. And following on the tail of Starship Troopers, there is Ender's Game. Now, Ender's Game has essentially the buggers, a bug-like alien species that they are at war with. They fought them, won a bit, so Starship Troopers can have their victory. But after the victory, they gained some understanding of the technology involved in some of the things going on, how things are moving through space the way they are, and advanced technologically. Ender's Game starts with that premise of we've learned more about how to move through space and become more technologically advanced because of the war with the bugs. And thus, they've developed their technology in such a way to allow sort of long-distance mental communication with virtual fleets that kind of leads back to the Tower and Hive and allows that we could wipe out the Hive species. And the consequences of that are from Ender's Game. And I've sort of left it hanging at the end of Ender's Game because there's a point at the end of a lot of these threads where they can start to stitch back together. But what I've done back up where we've come down from Minority Report, RoboCop, Neuromancer, and Snow Crash, we've gone Guilty Arm on one side and Ready Player One. So we've gone Psychic and Cyberpunk on opposite sides. And right down the middle, I have Cowboy Bebop, where I think it's viable to establish the idea of the gate in the Earth system that we've been using as a Stargate, the conflict that became involved with that. There are a couple times in the Stargate SG-1 universe where the gates are destroyed or stolen. In Cowboy Bebop, Earth built a series of gates that transport to the nearby planets and moons within our solar system and set up colonies on those worlds. But the gates were not as stable as they needed to be, and there was a glitch that happened and detonated the gate on the moon, destroying the moon and just devastating the Earth with bombardment of shards from the moon, because there's a huge chunk blown out of the moon. And that's Cowboy Bebop. You've got a settled solar system where the Earth is just bombarded every day by crashing asteroids from chunks of the moon, that it's just on the edge of no longer habitable. People are living on these small colonies on other moons and planets in our solar system. Well, taking that idea of the Cowboy Bebop universe, which is basically a crew of bounty hunters patrolling a universe where people get up to all sorts of shenanigans, trafficking stolen goods or whatever through the solar system, you're not super far, and there's a lot of similarities between these two series, Cowboy Bebop and Firefly. Firefly is a series that was basically, here's the story. The Earth got used up, or maybe it's being bombarded by shards of the moon that detonated. And the Earth got used up. So we relocated to another system with lots of planets and moons that we could inhabit, like they did in the Bebop universe. And we settled here. The central worlds became known as the Alliance, and they opposed the Independents. And that sort of conflict is what started out the crew of the Firefly, being smugglers and thieves, traveling between worlds and doing what they do. So that's a natural step forward from the Bebop universe. It works really well. And following that, if you expand it a little bit further, there's room to expand into Riddick and the Chronicles of Riddick setting, which again, everybody from Bebop, Firefly to Chronicles of Riddick, they're all human beings. There are no aliens involved. They're just all human beings. And most of it's modern day or near modern day, just with space travel on ships in close areas. It's not a huge, necessarily galaxy-spanning. Chronicles of Riddick moves a little bit into the direction of they've at least moved close to the core of the galaxy. They're able to travel between solar systems easier. So that's sort of like, it's the next logical step after Firefly, I feel like. And then from there, you have room to eventually move into a sort of a Star Trek universe as they start to maybe find the contact with the other 4 or 5 strings that we ran with. So far we started with, well, we ended up with Starship Trooper Ender's Game setting. We ended with Riddick setting. We ended with a Butlerian Jihad Dune setting. And we ended with a Terminator Battlestar Galactica on Earth setting. Now, remember, I started with Farscape, and that's John Crichton moving into another section of the galaxy where he finds a humanoid species called the Peacekeepers and a few other humanoid beings that become a travel around a vast sector of space where eventually the goal is to establish a peace between warring factions an area of space conflicted. So you can go from a Farscape setting out to a Babylon 5 setting. And Babylon 5 feels like the early stages that could lead to a Star Trek or a Star Wars. And so it's possible that we could go from Riddick to Star Wars or Riddick to Star Trek. And we could go from Babylon 5 to Star Wars or Babylon 5 to Star Trek. I feel like there's a preferred path for some of those. But in line with a lot of that, you now have an entire galaxy where there are 5 established settings that could be melded back together into a vast, complex universe full of events going on. So, like Star Trek has the Alpha Quadrant, Beta Quadrant, Gamma Quadrants, and I imagine Delta Quadrant. I don't think they ever mention it, but so they've divided the galaxy that we're in into quadrants. Star Wars has their own galaxy. It's not the same as ours, but if we pretended it's within the same universe or same galaxy as ours, they have predominantly core worlds and like hyperspace fast lanes that are really just like a string of worlds that are the known worlds within the Star Wars universe. You could put that right in the middle of the galaxy, and it would be kind of out of reach of a Star Trek setting, a Dune setting, Battlestar Galactica setting. It'd be out of reach of the Ender's Game setting. Babylon 5, Farscape, all those things, they won't cross necessarily. You could, when you split up at that key point with Gil the Arm, Cowboy Bebop, and Ready Player One, just beneath Minority Report, when you split the universe up so that the psychics have their own quadrant of the galaxy, and the Firefly is settling near Earth, and the Battlestar Galactica setting that goes through Blade Runners and Terminator, that happens on Earth. And the Butlerian Jihad happens nearby. It's sort of like, it's the other side of the Terminator setting. So you could easily set it up as, we expand out into the universe after the Blade Runner incident. We've gotten to a couple stars, and then the war breaks out with the Terminators. Earth falls back in on itself to try to deal with the Terminator situation. Meanwhile, out past where we got to is the settling that happens that leads up to the Butlerian Jihad and the discovery of the planet Arrakis. So now you've got, within that quadrant that it happens near Earth, that's all happening there. The Firefly setting, I think, makes the most sense to lead into a Star Wars setting. And I feel like Babylon 5 makes the most sense to lead into Star Trek. It's a little tricky because the actual setting for Farscape is distant from Earth, whereas Babylon 5 is Earth colonies exploring and meeting neighboring races. And then Star Trek has Sector 000, which is Earth. But if Farscape takes us to a place where the Peacekeepers are, and the Peacekeepers happen to refer to their planet as Terra Prime rather than Earth, then we could really just follow that forward. And there being peacekeepers, you could express it in a reasonable enough way that the Earth Minbari war that happens in Babylon 5, this is I'm hoping that you know some of these things, but you may not know all of them, and you don't have to. But taking the idea of the Babylon 5, there's an Earth Minbari war. You can take that concept as an extension of the Farscape peacekeepers conflicting with another race in the series. And then the Babylon 5 comes up as a peace point. And then the war that happens around Babylon 5 could be enough of a war that post that war, the humans, the Centauri, the Narn, Minbari, and the non-aligned worlds, or whatever they are, they could end up forming the foundations of the Galactic Republic, which would be the Knights of the Old Republic would be establishing the concept of the Jedi as partners within the Old Republic, which lasts for millennia until the Emperor takes over. And so you have the ability to do that. I do think that's a possibility, but I also think you could also go the route of Babylon 5 starts with the conflicts that happen there and establish the foundations of the Federation. Now, Babylon, Farscape, they do have a living ship that can jump through space. Babylon 5 uses jump gates, so a technology that reproduces a gate similar to the Stargate that we talked about. I don't know. I don't know what the best route to resolve that particular run is, but everything else seems to line up pretty well, I feel like, to a degree that once you really sit down and figure out those last little tie-in pieces and then figure out how those end pieces will relate to one another, you can really start to see, like, okay, with all of that worked out, if I start reworking pieces so that they're not as transparently following the original, because most of these you can't follow the original exactly because it breaks the chain that would otherwise fit together. The Tower and the Hive series ends with figuring out how to resolve a peaceful, find a peaceful resolution to the conflict with the Hive species. Aliens, however, should not end that way. And more than that, Aliens makes a lot of sense to end up going Starship Troopers on. And Starship Troopers, that military attack against the aliens, it sort of undoes the fact that they sort of resolve the Hive issues in Tower and Hive. So they shouldn't be able to string together that way. So you're going to have to tweak some of those storylines. And, you know, that's part of the appeal of doing this. You're really just taking the premise, the idea, the central conflict, some of the character relationships, and some of the world building that happened in those. And you're cherry picking the parts that will work with each other, and then rebuilding the settings in such a way that they string together in that sense and allow you to tell interesting and unique stories in a setting that really isn't Tower and Hive or Starship Troopers or Firefly or Ghost in the Shell. It's none of those things, but it's inspired by all of those things. And so that's really what I was doing here with this. that was how I've squandered some of my time lately. I could probably expand this a little bit further at some point and maybe make a writing universe and or a tabletop gaming universe out of it. But I think what I'm going to try to do going forward is re-examine that video where I made the list of pop culture stories and dig up some of the ones we haven't gotten to yet and maybe add some new ones. Because it's time I dig through the archives and see what I made before and see what I can do with some new stuff, some old stuff, and reimagining it all. I think that's probably where I should leave it tonight because I've been on here for an hour and 10 minutes and it's time for me to go eat. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening to my weird ramble. I will catch you on the morrow. Till then, take care. And have a good night. That's not how you spell have. There we go. Do it right? Yes, I did. I'll catch you later.